Thank you very much, Robert, for the introduction. Let me start by saying there's a reason it says 66 to 68 and not all the way to 70, and that was actually my loss. When I was a student at Shimer, it was during the Vietnam War, so it was a fascinating period to be on campus and so forth. But my brother was serving in the military, which made it doubly difficult because you fought with the very issues of war and then so forth. But my brother was killed. And as a consequence, I left Shimer. But it was the saddest decision I ever made because Shimer had a special spot for me here. And so it's always, I've always had a special place in my heart for Shimer. So it's great to be back. And I am the exception rather than the rule in that I did go into business and I did prosper all right. So I thought I would give you tonight and use this agenda for some discussion. First, some context, and it'll come more at the end of my time at Shimer. Then I really wanted to review a number of contemporary thoughts about the value of a higher education degree at all, and because it certainly is a topic of discussion, especially as the degrees get more and more expensive. And I also looked at the difference between entrepreneurial versus more traditional business environment, and how does Shimer fare in preparing people for life in general, but tonight specifically perhaps for the business world. There are some assumptions here that I'm going to make, and anyone can take critique of any of them because I think they are just that, assumptions. One is, I'm assuming that a college education, and in fact a degree itself, is a product. And all products have a value. And the value is not what you put in it. That's how you get to price. The value is what you take out of it. And so as we review this tonight, there is the assumption in here that we can derive a value to both a college education and to the degree itself. Tonight's discussion will also be highly subjective because some of these are totally my opinions, some of them are opinions of others that I will cite, and so nothing should be taken as the truth, but I assume, being a Shimer, that would be a truism. Anyway. I do not wish to offend anyone with any of the comments in here. I think I've edited it enough times that there is one where I do get off the rails, and I get railing about something in particular, but and then I'll try to leave time at the end so that we can talk it over. Hutchins had his idea in his period in believing that the Socratic method and reading the great books was a better way to educate young students. And for all the same reasons that Shimer has continued to exist, and St. John's for that matter, I think there is great merit in the argument that both the Great Books program and the Socratic method of reviewing them has great merit, and I think can compare favorably to a more traditional collegiate education. And in Hutchins' words, he did not believe that the object of the educational system was to produce hands for industry, such as my own, or to teach the young how to make a living. Instead, it was to produce responsible citizens. And I know that stays with Shimer in all of the mission statements and the literature I read. It's about your life as citizens and making the most of who you are, and that idea of self-actualization that is so important. I think it's also important to understand that Socrates, in thousands of years ago, was using a methodology that we still use, and that starts with the assumption that I know really nothing. And there's no better place to begin, because otherwise you're starting with assumptions, bigotries, biases, and so forth. That doesn't mean there aren't truths, but one needs to probably prove them. And I also think that the foundations of a hypothesis, deposing, and the whole dialectic method is not only good in academia, but is very good in business. Because in business, too often, if you're in the upper echelons, it can be a yes machine. That is not what you want to be a good business. FedEx is a perfect example. Whoever thought the easiest, quickest, and cheapest way to get a document from Boston to Los Angeles, or for that matter, across Los Angeles, would be to send it via Memphis, and that it would still be there the very next day. And so that was great thinking, and someone who propositioned it originally had to be thought a bit of a, way out there. But in fact, it is now, taken as very much by rote. The whole discussion about the value in education started for me with a dialogue, with an article written in 2008 in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it was entitled America's Most Overrated Product, again, laying into my belief that it is a product and we can view it for its value, the bachelor's degree. I will note, and I do think I noted in the last part of my presentation, it is by someone who managed to get 3 degrees and is questioning them, but this guidance counselor, Memco, out of Oakland, had several, I think, points of view that led people that read the Chronicle of Higher Education regularly to, listen to it. First of all, he starts that so many students that come out of the lower portions of their classes, a college education may not necessarily be right for them if you just took the failure rate into account. That doesn't mean that opportunity shouldn't be there and so forth, but 66% of those graduating the bottom 40% never complete their class. They drop out with a mountain of debt and arguably with some shrunken self-esteem. Those who do graduate may end up in a career where the college education is not a requirement at all. So there is some truth in that. And he made a very good point, and I think all of us that are living in our own communities see this. There's a real question of whether K through 12 is preparing our students today for the rigors of academia at the post-high school graduate levels. I think there are real issues with local education and how well it's doing, and it varies by town to town. He further noted that these negative outcomes are not aberrations, but in many ways are becoming more the truth and not the exception. And he, as a guidance counselor, believes a large number of people that go on to college are not fully prepared. And only 23% of graduating high school seniors, based on ACT exams, are ready for college. And I always thought the ACT was a little easier than the SAT, so that's a scary proposition. And even those that are ready and do come out are increasingly taking 5 and 6 years to complete the work. I can tell you in my era, and I don't like to date myself, but we really wanted to get out in 3 if we could, and 4 was okay. But it's interesting how many students, and I've spent 17 years in higher ed, really are there for the 5th or 6th year. Now I think that's largely preference, and I have no problem with it. I wish I could have afforded 6 years of time and of energy and money, but he does note that. And 40% of freshmen at 4-year institutions do not graduate. And again, they end up with a large amount of debt and with some need to self-reflect. UCLA's Higher Education Research Institute found that 44.6% of students weren't satisfied with their education. And I would proposition, if I were running a company like Barnes & Noble, and you weren't satisfied with what we did, how long would Barnes & Noble be around? And it wouldn't be around very long. And so the dissatisfaction rate among students is something that I think all colleges have to take into consideration. Again, I have a belief that it is less so at schools such as Shimer. I'm a trustee of a state university, You might guess which one from the introduction. And I'm amazed at the number of times that I teach a class, the preparation level, and the lack of inquiry on the part of the students into, when you ask them, what are you doing, and so forth. It's not as deep as I remembered it being. And so for me, it's a bit disconcerting as a business person. The Pew Charitable Trust found that 50% of graduating college seniors scored at only proficient levels. And when analyzed as to how well they could read an editorial and understand the meaning of that editorial. And if you know that Pew Charitable Trust is very focused on newspapers and public information and ensuring that it adds to the public debate and discourse. And so their tracking this, I think, is very, very interesting. And only 20% of those tested had sufficient quantitative skills from their testing. And over the past decade, literacy among college graduates has actually declined. And I will tell you that just listening to people talk and seeing pronouns used as poorly as they are used, it just, it's like on a chalkboard, the way people use me and him and so forth all the time. So, but I do know that Mr. Nemco did go on to get a PhD, so there's a bit of two sides of the mouth here. That was followed up by a story in the New York Times that had the thing is, college a waste of money. 2 prominent professors say yes. As with Nemco, these 2 professors said that professors were largely to blame. And again, I do want to distinguish, if not in your mind, in my own mind, the difference between a typical collegiate professor and a Shimer professor. I think there's a huge world of difference. There's a difference in their approach, there's a difference in how they expect to be. But as I'll show you in some other slides, there are a lot of college professors that really find students an annoyance. And the higher up you go in the echelon, I can tell you at Harvard, there were very few professors that really loved the teaching. They were there for research, and they would talk to a postgraduate on occasion, but they were not really interested in undergraduates. And the authors concluded there are no easy fix, and that self-interest, i.e. the self-interest of those people on the campus largely, of which the professors were one, that things aren't going to change easily. The New York Times, the other one was the Post, the New York Times had 2 sociologists that were studying. One was Rick Arum from NYU and Josiah Rosca from the University of Virginia. And they tracked 2,300 students through 4 years and ended up publishing this book, Academically Adrift, Limited Learning on College Campuses. So again, there's a real questioning as to how well is college preparing you to be successful in whatever endeavor you choose. At the end of the second year of following these students, they administered a test, and the data points that they found were really interesting. They tested for critical thinking, complex reasoning, and written communication. And they considered these 3 core to success in almost any endeavor, that some scoring there and having high attributes there were important. The results were very disappointing, and the whole article explains that. And that in reality, the scores were poor in the critical thinking, complex reasoning, and written communication. Again, I would like to say that I think especially the first 2, Shimer shines, because everything requires critical thinking and complex reasoning. Because as opposed to getting it from a textbook where someone is telling you this is truth, there is the assumption that when we read at Shimer, that was just the starting point where we read. And the great strength came from the time after that, not only in the class, but as I heard from the students over there, the dialogue that goes on and on and on and on and never seems to end as things are brought on. So here's kind of the rub on the negative side. People are criticizing teaching and the preparation that people are receiving in K through 12, and is it preparation for success, either college or later life? There are many that think that, again, entrenched interest, and this is one where I don't care if I'm the exception to everyone in the room. I do think teachers' unions are not helping solve the problem. I think they are part of the problem, because I know in so many places it's broke. And I'll show you Randy Weingarten here in a minute, and just an interview from her last Friday in the Wall Street Journal. Others are highly critical of the whole idea of tenure, especially for teachers in K through 12. Michelle Rhee in the District of Columbia, among others, tried to change that proposition. And where people have said forever that teachers are paid too little, she paid teachers $120,000 a year. But the offset was you don't have tenure, so that those that are successful will thrive. Mayor Bloomberg has called the idea of tenure educational suicide, in that too often you cannot get rid of a bad teacher. And if you think of it, think of the impact that that teacher has generation after generation of teaching if they're not really, if they don't have the skill sets required to ensure that that student is better when they leave the class and when they begin the class. So the entrenched interests, and again, Arnie Duncan, that you people would be very familiar with from Chicago here in Illinois, I think is one of those that's testing it. I think the president's administration is testing it. But it's interesting, Michelle Rhee was, she no longer is. And that is really a scary proposition. And it was all a political decision, not a success factor decision. It was a political decision that she's no longer. And then lastly, and this is most scary, there's no doubt in testing that's done of all sorts, comparing young people to young people around, especially the developed world, that we are performing poorly compared to probably about 15 or 16 countries that score above us in one area, and then on math, it's even higher, the number of schools, the number of countries that score higher. So here's under my skin, so at least I'm going to tell you that this is where my bias comes out here. But Randy Weingarten last Friday, as I read this article, by the way, I did write a counterpoint to her. I don't think the Wall Street Journal published it, but it did get under my skin enough that I did talk about it. She said, first of all, I think every child deserves a great education. So I was with her up to that point. But then they asked her, well, what do you think about tenure, where it's very, very hard to discipline, let alone terminate someone? And her answer was very legalistic. If you eliminate due process, what you get is we would lose innovation and risk-taking in schools. Now, I think it's just the opposite way around. I think if people were at risk, you would have more innovation, you would have more. But this makes a great legalistic. She's worried about due process, not the students. In fact, lacking in her article, and I would encourage you to go look at it, other than this one line, she said nothing about students, nothing. Then regarding layoffs of less competent tenure, she said, well, it's not a perfect mechanism, but it's the best mechanism we have. Again, not very optimistic when she heads the American Teachers Federation. And then she then went on to insist that teachers' unions are the agents of change, not defenders of the status quo. I'm sorry, I just don't believe it. I do not believe it. And the real strength of the AFT lies in their ability to obstruct. That seems counter to the point immediately above. Obstruction is different than being part of the solution. So, you know how I feel about Randy Weingarten. Nothing else from tonight. So let's give some opposite points of view that are much more optimistic and enlightening. Dea Neuberger, in a publication that they did, The Big Payoff, showed that you can see a direct correlation between educational achievement and the lifetime earning of a student. That without a high school graduate, is 1.2 lifetime earning, 1.6 for an associate, and 2.1 for a college graduate. So there are empirical numbers that say there is economic value creation, and even when you take in the cost of achieving that, the expenditure or your outlay is worth it in terms of your return. So those who earn a bachelor's degree and those who do not, the individual rate of return on investment in higher ed is sufficiently high to warrant the expenditure. Those are things as a business person I can get my head around. That's what I'm usually dealing with every day. I think the Institute of Higher Education found some other things which are equally important. Higher levels of savings, increased personal and professional mobility, there are more opportunities for people the more they progress with their education, improved quality of life for their offspring. And we often hear, I was the first person of my family to go to college and so forth. Columbia University's whole mandate was to be the educational oasis for immigrants in the first wave of immigrants who come to the United States. An Ivy League school whose mandate was, whoever the newest wave is, we need to get them into the system and we need to get them progressing along. So improved quality of life for their offspring, better consumer decision making, more hobbies and leisure time. Additionally, they've noted, and now you'll see I asterisked a number of them, and these are ones that I think are particularly true for Shimer. In my own evaluation, as I thought through this, I tried to take a critical eye to each of these, and I did think that Shimer students were definitely more open-minded. I think it's part of not only the methodology, but I don't think you'd be very successful here if you weren't open-minded. More cultured, and again, because of the exposure across multiple disciplines, and not where you just get in your kind of academic avenue, such as math or something. You really do get more cultural exposure. I believe you're more rational, more consistent and less authoritarian, decreased prejudice, enhanced knowledge of world affairs, and I couldn't tell you whether you guys have better health or not. If I was an example, it's and especially with what we were doing to our body during college. Joe Hadzimer is a very, very prominent professor who I respect a lot and been to a number of his lectures at MIT. And he notes some other things, and he works around entrepreneurship, and he sees that, and again, see the number of asterisks that I added in. I think there's ability to deal with risk, a results orientation, which is extremely important in entrepreneurship, energy, growth potential, team player, multitasking ability, and improvements oriented. These are all things that he believes are attributes that are necessary for someone to thrive in the entrepreneurial environment. And that's a very unique environment from something that's more structured. Disney was a very structured company that I worked for. And so entrepreneurial companies, there's a lot of risk taking and so forth. So these are the traits. And he called that having the right stuff in his way of referring to them for entrepreneurship. If we think of it, Hutchins in his era was having this very same critical thought process going on in his mind as to what is a better methodology for teaching and for educating young people and really preparing them for life. He put it in his way that no longer are we talking about the 3 R's in America, but we are talking about the 6 R's. Remedial reading, remedial writing, and remedial arithmetic was the way he put it. And I'm not so sure that viewing K through 12 that isn't still an issue that we have. He also said the most distressing aspect of the world into which you're going is its indifference to basic issues, which now is always moral. And again, I'm not at Shimer, I remember hours and hours and hours and days of dialogue around moral issues. Everything came back to some moral aspect. And I'm not sure that if I'm taking chem at another institution, that I'm going to have that same thought process around the morality of things. And the objective of education is to prepare young people not to educate themselves or prepare themselves for life. Anybody who feels at ease in today's world is a fool, and that may be the case still. So then I went to my own experience, and I've always measured people, and I learned this somewhere, so it's not an original thought, that people have basic skills, knowledge, and behaviors. And that when, for instance, I'm interviewing someone for a job, I'm really trying to hone in on what skills they have, what is their knowledge base, and importantly, very importantly, and most difficult to understand, are their behaviors. Because the behaviors are set at a very young age. Behaviors are set for many before age 5, 6, and then definitely 13, 14. Your basic behavioral set has been set. And it doesn't mean that it can't change, but it's with more difficulty that you change behaviors. So it's so often that people will say that person has the right skills and right knowledge, and they don't even look at behavioral traits. And then they can come in and they can be disruptive, they can break a team spirit, they can do all sorts of things. So that when I look at overall talent, I'm trying to look at skills, knowledge, and behavior. At lunch we were talking a little about the methodology we used at the Disney organization about hiring cast members. And not only did we spend a lot of one-on-one time, but then we would put 6 prospective cast members in a room, throw something at them, and just see how they interacted, and see if someone wanted to monopolize the group, if someone else didn't have anything to offer and felt, and none of those would be able to take ownership of the service experience that we wanted at Disney. We wanted optimally the service experience to be absolutely correct. So we were looking for those people that were confident enough in themselves, but more importantly, as opposed to a taker, they were a giver. Because you have to have a giving spirit to be successful and to service others and to be of service. And so many people that are in occupations that are non-business, that are altruistic in nature, is because they have the giving spirit more than the taking spirit. In fact, some hedge fund managers are really lacking in that. They've got the other one down. So that being the case, and we went back earlier and said that you can look at an education as a product, one way to formulate it would be to say skills plus knowledge plus behavior divided by the cost of the education equals its values. That's a little too simple. So you could, because it doesn't take into account the fourth one. So you could take skills plus knowledge plus behavior plus degree. Now, why do I say degree? Well, I'm telling you, if you walk in for an interview and it says Princeton or Harvard on there, it has some gravitas immediately. It is going to open a door or have some merit. And my University of New Hampshire, it's good up in Berlin, New Hampshire, but it probably didn't open as many doors as some other things. So the degree itself is important. By the way, having said that, I think that's all very kind of sophomoric in thought process and so forth. It's just the idea that clearly there are brands, educational brands, that have more value than others. Now, you can get a job without a degree, so the proposition doesn't necessarily hold. Likewise, you can get a degree and there are no degree requirements for the job, so that doesn't hold. And you can clearly add to other positive outcomes here to get a better formula for the value proposition. So, first of all, I do agree that we have to view it as a product and view some values. It's interesting, in America, we spend 10% on our youth and 90% on our aged, and that's largely because of both Social Security and Medicaid, Medicare, and those sorts of things. But if you look at the budgets across all municipalities, only 10% is spent directed at bringing people through the early years, and 90% is spent exiting our life. That's one of the discussions. There's also many people that believe that a college education is escalating much faster. The cost is escalating much faster, definitely, than inflation. But it's also escalating at times that only healthcare is comparable to. And again, value is not the cost of what you put into something. Value is what people are going to take out of it. So often in, let's say, the restaurant business, which I've had a lot of experience in the restaurant business, people, when they have a new item they want to put on the menu, they say, well, it cost me $1 to sell, so the formula is you mark it up 3 times. Well, we need to sell it for $3. And I'll ask them, all right, put it out for me. Would you pay $3 for that? That's where you ought to start, is that's worth $3. More importantly, it might be worth more than $3. A perfect example of that was the day at Disneyland when it's 90 degrees, a bottle of water can sell for any number you want to put on it. And they did, or we did. So there are variations that go in that. So the product's content divided by price is only one aspect of valuation. Far more important is what you take out of it. Interesting thought. Education actually appreciates in value. Many other things, you buy a new car, it's going to depreciate over time. But a college degree is going to appreciate over time, because as you get more job experience and you have the degree opens up doors, because, as you know, many positions require the prerequisite of having a degree. I came across, then I started thinking about the students themselves, and I came across this quote talking about the value here in higher education. And Jose Marti said, "Students are the rampart in the strongest army of freedom. When liberty is in danger, a newspaper threatened, a ballot box in peril, the students unite. And arm in arm they go through the streets demanding justice." And if we look at the world around us now, we can prove that proposition. It happened in Europe and the Iron Curtain in the 80s. It's happening now across North Africa and the Middle East. And it is the students who are leading this. And thank God that that is the case. Because as we all know, as we become more vested and entrenched, the less often we take on the structures that are there. And so thank goodness that around the world, students are leading this. So, and education is essential to the ideal of the very ideals of our Constitution, of our Declaration of Independence, and it is those ideals that are really impacting people around the world now, as more and more, and again, Shimer's emphasis on that, Shimer's emphasis on understanding the Constitution, the Declaration, and all the founding documents, and what they mean about personal liberty, and about individual responsibility, and so forth. So, earlier we saw that critical thinking, complex reasoning, and written communication, and again, I've asterisked them because I think they are very important. There's also, in business, very often, what's used is called a 360 evaluation. And the idea of a 360 is to get a total view of the individual. And so I went and found some old 360s that I had in business and used in business when evaluating both incumbents and new people. And so I want to show you what a 360 instrument measures and point out the number of them that I think where Shimer students would shine and would do very well on a 360. Communication. Clearly, there's a lot of difference between sitting in a lecture class and being one of 700 and being one of less than 12 who is expected to engage in the topic that's at hand. And silence is not a real acceptable proposition. Leadership. There's leadership that is derived from being in a small school. There's also leadership that's derived from being in a class. We all know that we oftentimes sit in a group of 8, 10 people, and we're just waiting for this one person to speak who we always know when they speak something really wise comes out. And that's often the case in a Shimer class, where someone has an insight. But what's more important are the insights of the 8 to 10 other people. And so leadership. Adaptability, the ability to take on the opinion of some other participant in the class, and certainly makes for adaptability. Relationships, how good building relationships. And again, at Shimer, we were all very, very close to each other because it was small. I actually remember I became very close with my roommate. He was a 4th year student and I was the first. in my very first evening, just to give you a little background, I come from the most rural part of New Hampshire. I mean, really rural, almost Appalachia. And it was the first time I ever flew to come to Shimer. And I flew, my first flight was on a DC-3 that haven't flown in the last 40 years, but they were ones where the seats ramped up this way and you had to walk up the aisle to get to your seat. That was the first flight I was ever on. I remember the stewardess got out of the flight and she was vomiting because it had been such a horrific flight up from Boston to northern New Hampshire coming over the mountains. So I was thinking, ooh, flying doesn't sound. And then I remember getting on Trans-World Airline and coming here, and my mother told me, no, you've got to go to the Palmer House, and so she'd arranged that that's where I would stay, and then getting the train, and then arriving at Marijuana Junction, or whatever the theme of the day was. But my first night was spent with a student whose name I've lost, but I was in a building that was called the 4-minute building, because if a fire caught, you had 4 minutes to get out, and they told us so. Even then, there weren't big capital budgets. So I remember all of a sudden, about 3 in the morning, hearing Ravi Shankar music playing, which in northern New Hampshire I had not heard. And I looked over to see my roommate sitting in concentric circles of fire. He had taken a lighter fluid, and he had these circles coming out from him. So after my flights and my overnight at the Palmer House, my first experience was that, and I really thought I had gone to the asylum. I actually did think it was a trick on my parents' part, and they hadn't told me everything. Although, as I will tell you at the end, it was totally my decision. Task management, production, development of others, I think Shimerians thrive at, because there is this need to focus on others in the class. And then obviously personal development. You can't look into these classic texts as deeply as you need to without great personal development. And you can't engage your fellow students in dialogue, open dialogue, and holding your place and your point of view without great personal development. Some of the other things that are measured on a 360 are the ability to listen to others. Think of that for Shimer students. Obviously, in a big lecture hall, you do get to listen very actively. But if you go into most lecture halls now, you'll see them multitasking, and they're really on Facebook and all sorts of other things. That's not the case at Shimer. The ability to process information, the ability to communicate effectively, the instilling of trust. There is a trust that comes out of a Shimer education and dealing with things. You trust that when your student gets in the room, they're going to have read the text and they're going to be ready. You learn, again, to trust. There are always those that seem exceptional in the classes, and you say, wow, that's an insight I never had. Or in studying at Oxford and doing PP&E there, and the thought process that went into that. There's so many ways that I think trust is built. Provides direction, delegates effectively, adjusts to circumstances and reality. The whole Shimer community should be very high on that, adjusting to circumstances. Thinks critically, again, that's the whole basis of the Shimer education. Builds personal relationships, fosters team accomplishment, and motivates and inspires others. These are all on a 360 instrument that probably 60% of businesses use to measure. And look at the number of them where, at least to my belief, a Shimer education gives you a step up and an extra opportunity for success. So, about me. From my earliest time, I really came here and I had all the scripts that had been put on me by teachers, by my family, and that was, there were prejudices, there were bigotries, and so forth. And they're things that we fight all our life, but you come with them with a lot. And Shimer was the first point where I really had to engage myself very deeply and personally and say, well, where did I get that data point? Where did that script come from? And what's wrong with it? And again, as I said, I was during the Vietnam War, and I had 2 brothers fighting and myself engaged in a different dialogue. And it was a very difficult time. But I did know that I was changing. It was scary too, because not only because of the bonfires, but it was also scary because when you are having to critically look at your own thought processes, it does shake you to your core. But I will tell you, it's wonderful when you shake out the core because you get rid of a lot of cobwebs of deceit and deception and bigotries and biases and so forth. So I also learned to love reading here. It's something I do. One of my happiest jobs was as president of Barnes & Noble. Not only was it nice because I had my own private jet, which was one of the nicest, but I had books galore, and I would go out every week, and then I'd basically spend my paycheck, not really, but I'd spend a lot of money on books, and had a very, very large library, which then became a complication every time I had to move. But I did learn that. I felt that I was in a family of truth seekers, because we never accepted things on face value. And as I said, the discussions went way, 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 way into the evening, through the evening for that matter. And as the last one, we talked every night about those things. So to me, the Shimer education goes back to Socrates: the unexamined life is not worth living. And I don't think you can be comfortable and successful at Shimer without starting from that proposition. And I think that's a great place to start and enter the business world with the very same thing. Now, admittedly, you have to build up some skill sets and some nuances as to how to get others to the same point of view, because there are some that believe they have truth and justice on their side. There is great power in a liberal education, and especially in the way that Shimer defines a liberal education, which is more about the very essence of democracy, the very essence of lifelong learning, but citizenry and so many other things. So many schools, I can't tell you a campus that I've been on, and as I said, I spent 17 years at 3 major campuses, and there wasn't one of them that at some time or another wasn't going through, well, what's the core curriculum? I think we need to change the core curriculum. And at Shimer, it's as simple as changing a text and so forth, because there's a great starting point that the others don't necessarily have. At the University of New Hampshire, we're going through this now, and it's all the way to the trustee levels as to what truly is core and how do we ensure liberal education. And again, the Shimer is great on the idea of liberty and freedom of the mind, and I assure you, if you're a student here now, that you'll go forth with that same point of view as you approach life, because it becomes a way of dealing with life, not just classes. So intellectual freedom. Shimer finds the highest liberty to consist of the freedom of mind, that is, the freedom from unexamined assumption, swings in intellectual fashion, partisan politics, and ideology. This is from your own mission statement, and so forth. On many campuses, they teach you what they believe to be the truth. At Shimer, I think they teach you how to find the truth. But I can tell you, I know many, many professors who really believe they have truth, and they will stand and administer it, similar to what I'm doing here, I guess. Because someone says it so doesn't make it so. Using the Socratic method is just such the exception. And this came out of Wikipedia, a quote that I found from a graduate. It said, "What makes Shimer unique is its dedication to the truth, to be found by free and open inquiry and discussion." And again, I can tell you that 70 or 80% of your classes at a more traditional university, that inquiry wouldn't happen until you're in your upper classes and your electives and really in your major discipline that you would have any opportunity to do that. And a quote that I've always liked, John Dewey, who was also an educator, said, "Not perfection is the final goal, but the ever ensued act of perfecting." And I think that Shimer gets you ready for that. So, all of these were things that I asterisked when we went through. I think all of them are of value. So, in addition to all those skills and aptitudes and so forth, I just come back to the concept that it is truly a unique learning environment, and it is so helpful to have a person really thrive in all of their life. So much is the classroom, as I've said, and the required texts, which are just superb. That kind of discussion, dialogue, and questioning is not there. The very idea of reading not text but first works, and I just think it's a truly unique environment. And I did come back to one point, and this was personal behavior. As I said earlier, it's a lot easier to understand what skills and knowledge you get out of something and behaviors. But if you notice, many of those things measured in the 360 that we gave an asterisk to, or I gave an asterisk to, are behavioral. And I think Shimer, for me, has done a very good job with building and developing that. The focus on the liberal education is a commitment to enhance self-examination and a strong foundation. I think the trust that's built is a behavior that will serve you well in life, because if you enter situations you're either going to enter in a distrustful or a trustful manner, and if you can enter every opportunity with an inherent belief and trust, the trustworthiness of the other one. Now listen, you'll be bitten a lot of times, but I still am going to start there. I think it's the only place to start. I was talking lunch today again. Many people that I know in business are very concerned about the generations that are coming through. They see them as different, not having the same values. Well, they don't. And whether they're Gen X, Gen Y, or millennials, they will fit into the work environment differently. So that assumption is true. And it's the job of business to understand how each of them do fit in, because clearly they're needed. And but this last one is kind of scary, that 70% of responders said there's big concern with the makeup of incoming workforces. And it's largely because they don't want a job for 40 years. That's a scary thing, the most basic thing. Or that they're not going to take one answer as the answer, and so forth. And many businesses would like it that way. So I'm ending up here. I would proposition, without much evidence to the affirmative, that positive behavioral attributes are, or may be, a byproduct of Shimer education. I'm enormously, or I look very favorably on those that teach here, because they do so because of the work that is involved. So there's a great altruism in teaching here. Many of the people that you're dealing with as students now are the ones that I dealt with, so it shows you that there's a love of the institution. The unexamined life is not worth learning, and so starting here. And I don't believe on those other campuses, even Harvard, as wonderful as that was, and I had a beautiful time there the same way. So, Shimer rules. I cannot help but be struck by the skills, knowledge, and behaviors that are impacted by the way Shimer uses the Socratic method. Shimer teaches us all how to be open-minded and think critically. The classroom setting that you're going to have all the way through the 4 years, as opposed to a little bit, will develop so many aspects of your behaviors and so forth. And the liberal education, with all its implications, is great for developing future leaders and all sorts of things. And by the way, I know many people that come out of Shimer really go on to become great educators themselves and a PhD. So the top quote many will remember, I think it was Newsweek, but it may have been Time, had the article in 65, and it said Shimer College, unknown, unsung, and unusual. And I read that article and I decided it's the only place I wanted to go. I really did. My father was a Dartmouth grad and I was going to Dartmouth, and all right, if not, we'll compromise on Bowdoin and so forth. But, and I had no idea what Shimer was, other than this one article, but the article made a huge impact because it spoke to me. By the way, there was a thing that I just picked up here, something that you've developed that speaks the same way. Of course, it's self-interested because it's written by the university itself, but it does talk to many of the same things that hit me in reading that article. So I came in 65. I continue to be an enthusiastic supporter of Shimer's mission and the way it educates young, and I wish it was the model for more and more other places. Thank goodness that St. John's and Shimer are there. And I feel confident that I, and this is a person I can speak for, I received the value for every penny that I paid, and I don't even remember how much it was. So thank you very much. I'm glad to have dialogue and so forth around what has been said, and if you need to contact me, there it is, and you can call and write and nasty things and so forth. Any thoughts?